I saw Bigfoot. I know where they're hiding. It's inside the mountains, and I've got proof. 30 years of my life dedicated to proving Bigfoot exists. My friends stopped inviting me to parties because all I wanted to talk about was footprint casts and hair samples and that grainy footage from Bluff Creek. My extended family thought I'd lost my mind completely, especially after I turned down a promotion at work because it would mean less time for weekend expeditions. People at the lumber mill would roll their eyes when I came in Monday morning with new stories about weekend trips that yielded nothing but mosquito bites, poison ivy rashes, and a few blurry photographs that could have been anything. But what I found deep in those mountain caves changed everything we think we know about these creatures, everything we believe about Bigfoot, about their intelligence, about their very existence. I found proof that will haunt me for the rest of my life, not because I couldn't share it, but because I chose not to. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because if you're going to understand why I made the choices I did, why I walked away from the discovery of a lifetime, you need to know the whole story. You need to know what drove me to spend 3 decades of my life on what everyone else considered a complete waste of time. It started when I was 17 years old. My old man and I were hunting elk in the Cascade Mountains, about 60 miles from the nearest town, in a section of wilderness that most hunters avoided because the terrain was too rough and the trails too poorly maintained. We'd been out there 3 full days and hadn't seen much of anything besides a few does drinking from a creek and some coyote tracks near our campsite. The afternoon sun was starting to dip below the tree line, painting everything in that golden light you only get in late autumn, and we were heading back to camp when we heard it. A sound that made every hair on my body stand straight up. At first, I thought it was a bear. We had grizzlies in those mountains, and I'd heard them before, that huffing grunt they make when they're warning you to back off. But this sound was completely different. It was too high-pitched, too deliberate, too organized. It started as a low whoop that echoed through the valley, bouncing off the granite cliffs and rolling back over us in waves. Then it built into this horrible, gut-wrenching scream that seemed to vibrate in my chest cavity. It wasn't pain or fear or anger. It was communication. It was a call. And something answered it from the opposite ridge, another howl that harmonized with the first in a way that made my bones feel like they were turning to liquid. My old man grabbed my arm so hard I had finger-shaped bruises for a week afterward. His face had gone completely pale, and I could see his hand shaking even though he was trying to hide it. We stood there absolutely frozen, not even breathing, while this thing howled at us from somewhere up the mountain. The sound went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 or 40 seconds. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. Every bird had stopped singing, every insect had gone quiet. The whole forest was holding its breath. When we got back to camp, my old man didn't say a single word. He just started packing up our gear with quick, efficient movements, his jaw set in that way that meant don't ask questions and don't slow me down. We broke camp in record time, stuffed everything into the truck bed without bothering to organize it properly, and got out of there before dark. The drive home took 4 hours on those winding mountain roads, and he didn't speak once. Not when we stopped for gas, not when we grabbed food at a drive-thru, not during the entire trip. Just stared straight ahead at the road with white knuckles gripping the steering wheel. When we finally pulled into the driveway at home, he turned off the engine and sat there for a long moment. Then he looked at me with the most serious expression I'd ever seen on his face and said just 3 words. That was Bigfoot. Then he got out of the truck and went inside, and we never talked about it again. But those 3 words changed my life forever. I spent the next few months completely obsessed. I read everything I could find about Bigfoot, which back then meant driving to libraries in 3 different counties and special ordering books through interlibrary loan because the internet was still pretty new and most of the good information hadn't been digitized yet. I devoured reports from the Pacific Northwest, accounts from the Himalayas about the Yeti, stories from First Nations people about the Sasquatch. I learned about the Patterson-Gimlin film from 1967, and that grainy footage became something like my Bible. I must have watched it 1,000 times, analyzing every single frame, every tiny detail of that massive creature walking through Bluff Creek. The way the Bigfoot moved in that film, the way its muscles flexed and rippled under all that dark fur, the way its arms swung in perfect rhythm as it walked away from the camera. And then that moment where it turned to look back, just glanced over its shoulder at Patterson and Gimlin with that calm, almost curious expression. You can't fake that. I don't care what the skeptics say about men in monkey suits. No costume in 1967 could replicate the way that creature's trapezius muscles bunched when it turned its head, or the way its gluteus muscles contracted with each step, or how its entire body moved as one fluid, natural unit. I studied anatomy books alongside the Bigfoot film, comparing the movement to human biomechanics and primate locomotion. And everything about that footage screamed real. By the time I turned 20, I'd been on a dozen expeditions. Nothing major at first, just weekend trips to known Bigfoot hotspots in the Pacific Northwest. I'd go out Friday after work, spend Saturday and Sunday hiking through remote areas, and drive back home exhausted on Sunday night. I'd hear wood knocks echoing through the forest at night, that distinctive sound of something massive striking a tree trunk in a rhythmic pattern that echoed for miles. I'd find footprints pressed deep into muddy riverbanks, prints that were twice the size of my size 11 boots and showed a stride length that no human could match. Once, I found a deer carcass that had been torn apart with such brutal force that ribs were snapped like kindling, the spine twisted at an unnatural angle. The deer's hindquarters had been ripped completely off, and whatever killed it had done so without any of the claw marks you'd see from a bear or the puncture wounds from a mountain lion's teeth. It was like something had just grabbed the animal and pulled it apart through sheer strength. The vegetation around the kill site was trampled in a circular pattern, with bent saplings and crushed undergrowth suggesting something incredibly heavy had moved through the area. But I never saw one, not once in all those early trips, just signs and sounds and that ever-present feeling of being watched. It drove me absolutely crazy. I'd be lying in my tent at 3 a.m, unable to sleep, listening to something massive circling my campsite in the darkness. I'd hear branches snapping under impossible weight, footsteps that sounded like someone dropping bowling balls on the forest floor, heavy breathing that was too deep and too rhythmic to be any normal animal. And I'd stay perfectly still under my sleeping bag, barely breathing, knowing with absolute certainty that a Bigfoot was right there, maybe 10 feet from my tent. But by the time I worked up the courage to shine my flashlight out through the mesh window, whatever it was had always melted back into the forest like smoke. The years started to blur together. I got a job at the lumber mill specifically because it had good benefits and steady hours that let me take long weekends for expeditions. I lived in a cheap apartment with barely any furniture because every spare dollar went into equipment. Better cameras with night vision capabilities, audio recording equipment that could pick up vocalizations at great distances, plaster for making casts of footprints, motion-activated trail cameras that I'd hang in trees along game trails. My apartment looked less like a home and more like a Bigfoot research headquarters, with topographical maps covering the walls, filing cabinets full of sighting reports, and boxes of plaster casts and hair samples I'd collected over the years. I spent every vacation day, every long weekend, every spare moment in the wilderness. I learned to track like the old-timers had taught me, the ones who'd grown up in these mountains and knew them like the backs of their hands. I could read bent branches and disturbed moss, could tell the difference between a deer trail and something much larger moving through the forest. I learned to recognize the subtle signs that most people would walk right past without noticing. A sapling bent at exactly the wrong angle. Moss scraped off a boulder at 7 feet high. Handprints pressed into soft mud that showed 5 fingers, but proportions that were all wrong for human hands. Over the years, I had a few more significant encounters, events that kept the flame alive when I was starting to doubt myself. There was the time up near Mount St. Helens when I found a series of massive handprints pressed deep into the bark of a western red cedar, each print positioned 12 feet off the ground in a vertical line going up the trunk. Whatever made those prints had climbed that tree using handholds that would be completely out of reach for any human. I made plaster casts of the bark impressions, capturing the detail of each finger, the spacing of the palm, the sheer size that dwarfed my own hand when I held it up for comparison. My extended family had long since written me off as the crazy one. At family gatherings, which I rarely attended anyway because they usually conflicted with BIGFOOT conferences or Prime research season, people would ask what I'd been up to with that tone of voice that said they were just being polite, didn't actually want to know. When I'd mention my latest expedition or a promising new area I wanted to investigate, I'd see eyes glaze over and people would suddenly remember they needed to refresh their drinks or check on something in the kitchen. My younger relatives thought I was a weird uncle to avoid, and the older generation just looked at me with pity and changed the subject as quickly as possible. Some nights, lying alone in my apartment surrounded by all my equipment and research materials, I'd wonder if everyone was right. Maybe I'd lost my mind. Maybe that scream I heard at 17 had broken something in my brain, and I'd spent 30 years chasing a delusion. Maybe all those signs I'd found had rational explanations that I was too obsessed to see. Maybe I was just a cautionary tale about what happens when you let a childhood experience define your entire adult life. But then last October, everything changed. Everything I'd been searching for, everything I'd sacrificed, suddenly became real in a way that exceeded my wildest expectations and terrified me in ways I never anticipated. I was up in the North Cascades, in a remote section of wilderness that most people don't even know exists. It's all granite cliffs and dense old-growth forest, the kind of place where you can walk for days without seeing another human being or any sign that humans had ever been there. The trails, what few existed, were barely maintained and often disappeared entirely under thick undergrowth. Cell phone service was non-existent. If something went wrong up there, you were on your own. I'd been tracking what I believe was a BIGFOOT for 3 days straight. The signs were everywhere, more concentrated than anything I'd seen in 3 decades of searching. Fresh footprints in the morning dew, each one pressed deep enough into the soft earth that I could make detailed casts. Trees that had been stripped of bark at heights between 8 and 10 feet off the ground, with the bark peeled away in long strips that suggested powerful hands rather than claws or teeth. Rock stacks that would appear overnight in geometrically perfect arrangements, balanced in ways that shouldn't be possible, as if someone was deliberately leaving markers or messages. The feeling of being watched was constant and overwhelming. Every time I stopped to rest or examine evidence, I get this prickling sensation on the back of my neck, that animal instinct that says you're being observed by something you can't see. I'd scan the tree line and the ridges, but nothing was ever visible. Whatever was tracking me was too smart, too experienced at staying hidden. It was like playing chess with an opponent who was always 3 moves ahead. On the 4th day, I was climbing along a ridgeline, pulling myself up over granite boulders and navigating through dense patches of mountain hemlock when something made me stop dead in my tracks. Call it instinct, call it luck, call it whatever you want. I just had this overwhelming feeling, this absolute certainty that I needed to look to my right. So I did. And there, in a narrow crack between two massive granite slabs about 50 yards away, partially hidden by shadow in the afternoon light, I saw it. A face, a Bigfoot face, watching me. Dark, reddish-brown fur covered everything except around the eyes and mouth. Deep-set eyes that caught the afternoon sunlight and reflected it back at me with an intelligence that made my heart stop completely. Not animal intelligence, not the blank stare of a deer or the cunning wariness of a bear. This was something else entirely. The eyes tracked my movement, analyzed me, made decisions about what I was and whether I was a threat. The Bigfoot was watching me with the same level of awareness that I was watching it. We locked eyes for maybe 3 or 4 seconds, but it felt like time had stopped completely. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about proof or vindication or finally showing the world I'd been right all along. I was just frozen, my entire body locked up with a mixture of awe and primal fear, staring into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist, but absolutely, undeniably did. Then the Bigfoot pulled back into the crack, moved deeper into the shadows, and was gone. Disappeared like it had never been there at all. I stood there shaking for what must have been 5 full minutes, my legs trembling so badly I thought I might collapse. After 30 years of searching, of chasing sounds and analyzing footprints and examining blurry photographs, I had finally seen one. Not from a distance, not a glimpse through trees or a shadow moving through the forest. I had looked a Bigfoot directly in the eyes from 50 yards away in clear afternoon light. And more than that, I knew with absolute certainty that it had been watching me for hours, maybe days. That feeling of being observed hadn't been paranoia or imagination. It had been real. The Bigfoot had been tracking me just as much as I'd been tracking it. When I could finally move again, I scrambled over to where I'd seen the face. My hands were scraped raw on the rough granite. My knees bruised from slipping on loose rock, but I didn't care. I had to see where it had gone, had to understand how it had disappeared so completely. The crack in the mountain was narrow, maybe 2 feet wide at its widest point, squeezed between 2 enormous slabs of granite that had probably split apart during some ancient earthquake or avalanche. I approached it carefully, every instinct screaming that I was being stupid, that I was walking directly into danger. But I couldn't stop myself. I shined my flashlight into the darkness of the crack and saw it opened up into something bigger. The beam disappeared into depth, suggesting a large cavity beyond the narrow entrance, a cave system. And in that moment, like a switch being flipped in my brain, I understood. This was how Bigfoot stayed so hidden. This was how they survived winters and avoided detection and managed to remain nothing but legends and blurry photographs for centuries. They weren't just living in the forest, sleeping under trees, and wandering through the wilderness. They were living beneath the mountains in cave systems that humans never explored because the entrances were too narrow or too high or too hidden to find. I made a decision right there on that mountainside, a stupid, reckless, absolutely insane decision that I knew might get me killed, but that I was going to do anyway. I was going in. After 3 decades of searching, after sacrificing everything for this quest, after being mocked and pitied and dismissed as crazy for 30 solid years, I was not going to turn back now. I didn't care about the danger. I didn't care that I was alone with minimal supplies and that no one knew exactly where I was. I didn't care that I was about to squeeze through a crack in a mountain and crawl into a Bigfoot's home. This was my chance. Maybe my only chance. And I was taking it. The first few 100 feet were manageable but claustrophobic. I had to turn sideways and shuffle through the crack, my backpack scraping against rough stone on one side and my chest pressed against granite on the other. In some places, the opening narrowed to barely 18 inches, and I had to exhale completely to squeeze through, my heart hammering against my ribs as I wondered what would happen if I got stuck. But the crack angled downward and slowly widened, and eventually I was able to turn forward and walk normally, though hunched over to avoid hitting my head on the low ceiling. The passage opened into a larger chamber, and I straightened up with relief, my back aching from being bent over for so long. The chamber was maybe 20 feet across and 12 feet high at the center, with a floor of smooth stone that suggested water had once flowed through here, probably thousands of years ago. It was pitch black. My flashlight beam barely penetrated the darkness, the light seeming to get swallowed up by the stone. The ceiling stretched up into nothingness above me, and I could hear water dripping somewhere far off, each drop echoing in the vast space. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath, and it smelled like damp earth and ancient stone and something else. Something that didn't belong in a place that should have been empty. Something animal and alive. I kept going. The chamber had 3 different passages leading off from it, tunnels that disappeared into complete darkness. I chose the largest one, figuring that if Bigfoot used these caves regularly, they'd need passages big enough for their massive bodies. The cave system was complex, a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers carved out over millions of years by water and geological forces I couldn't begin to understand. Some passages were so low I had to crawl on my belly, my backpack catching on stone protrusions and forcing me to wiggle forward inch by inch. Others opened up into vast underground caverns where my flashlight beam couldn't reach the walls or ceiling, where the darkness seemed to go on forever in all directions. I marked my path carefully with white chalk, drawing large arrows on the stone walls to show which direction led back to the surface. Every 20 feet or so, I'd stop and make another mark, always pointing back towards safety. It was basic cave exploration protocol, the kind of thing everyone learns before going underground. But even with the marks, I was starting to feel disoriented. The tunnels twisted and turned in ways that made it hard to maintain a sense of direction. Was I heading deeper into the mountain or angling back toward the surface? Without the sun or any landmarks, it was impossible to tell. After what felt like hours of exploration, though it was probably only 45 minutes or so, I found the first real sign of Bigfoot. A handprint pressed deep into a patch of wet clay on the cave floor, the mud soft enough that every detail was captured perfectly. The palm was enormous, easily twice the size of my own hand, maybe 10 or 11 inches across. But it wasn't just the size that stopped me cold, it was the fingers, long and thick, each one ending in a blunt tip that had left circular impressions in the clay. The thumb was positioned like a human thumb, opposable, and set at the right angle for grasping and manipulating objects. But the proportions were all wrong for human hands. The fingers were too thick, the palm too broad, the overall structure suggesting incredible strength. I knelt there for a long time just staring at that handprint. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst right through my chest. This was it. Undeniable proof that I was inside Bigfoot territory. This was their home, their sanctuary, their hidden world beneath the mountains. And I was an intruder, uninvited and unwanted. That's when I should have turned back. That's when any sane person would have taken photographs of the handprint, made a plaster cast if possible, and gotten the hell out of there while they still could. But I'd come too far to stop now. I needed more. I needed to see them again, needed to gather more evidence, needed to understand how they lived down here in the darkness. I needed proof that would make the whole world believe. Proof that was so overwhelming and undeniable that even the most hardcore skeptics would have to accept reality. So I pushed deeper into the cave system, following what I hoped were signs of regular Bigfoot activity. The passages became more complex as I went deeper. They twisted and turned and branched off in multiple directions, creating a three-dimensional maze that would be almost impossible to map without proper surveying equipment. I was still making my chalk marks, but they were becoming less useful as the passages multiplied. I'd mark an arrow pointing back, but then the tunnel would split into three directions, and I'd have to decide which way to go forward, and by the time I wanted to return, I'd forgotten which branch I'd come from. Still, I kept finding signs that made me certain I was on the right track. A tuft of dark reddish-brown fur caught on a sharp projection of rock at about 7 feet high. Deep scratch marks on the walls gouge into the stone at heights no human could reach without a ladder. And that smell, that distinctive Bigfoot odor that I'd encountered years ago, gradually growing stronger as I penetrated deeper into the cave system. Then I got lost, really, truly, completely lost. I'd been so focused on following the signs of Bigfoot activity that I'd stopped paying close attention to my chalk arrows. I tried to retrace my steps, but every tunnel looked identical in the darkness. Gray stone walls, rough and uneven, low ceilings that forced me to duck. The constant sound of dripping water that echoed from every direction and made it impossible to orient myself by sound. My flashlight beam bounced off endless stretches of identical rock. I'd come to an intersection and see 3 tunnels, all of them looking exactly the same, with no idea which one I'd originally come from. Panic started to creep in, cold fingers of fear wrapping around my heart. I checked my supplies. I had 3 granola bars, a half-empty bottle of water, and a flashlight that was already starting to dim after hours of continuous use. I'd packed for a day trip, not a multi-day cave expedition. I'd been so stupid, so reckless. 30 years of experience in the wilderness, and I'd made the most basic, most deadly mistake possible. I'd ventured into unknown territory without adequate preparation or backup. I kept walking, hoping to stumble onto something familiar. Hours dragged by. My flashlight died, and I switched to the small backup I always carried in my pocket. Then that one started to fade too, the beam growing dimmer and dimmer until it was barely brighter than a candle. I rationed my water and food carefully, taking the tiniest sips and bites to make them last as long as possible. But I knew I was in serious trouble. Without light, without supplies, without anyone knowing where I was or even which mountain range I was exploring, I was going to die in these caves. I was going to become just another missing person statistic, and no one would ever know what really happened to me. By the second day, or what I thought was the second day, since I had absolutely no way to track time in the complete darkness of the caves, I was delirious with hunger and thirst. I'd finished my water early on, and now I was licking moisture off the cave walls, my tongue running over cold, wet stone to capture any bit of liquid I could find. My last granola bar had been consumed in tiny bites, stretched out over what felt like an entire day. My body was starting to shut down. I'd walk until I was too exhausted to continue, then collapse against the stone wall and try to sleep. But sleep brought nothing but nightmares, dreams of dying alone in the darkness. My body never found, slowly decomposing in the bowels of the mountain, while the world above moved on without ever knowing what had happened to me. On what might have been the 3rd day, though I'd completely lost track of time, and it might have been the 4th or 5th day for all I knew, I was crawling more than walking. My legs wouldn't support my weight anymore. I was navigating by touch alone, feeling my way along the walls with my hands, taking each movement slowly and carefully to avoid falling into some unseen pit or crevasse. My hands were shredded, bloody from scraping against sharp rocks and jutting crystals. My clothes were torn to rags. I'd lost my backpack somewhere hours or maybe days ago. Just dropped it when I was too weak to carry the weight anymore. I thought about my old man a lot during those dark hours, about that day in the Cascades when I was 17, when we heard that scream, and he'd gripped my arm so hard it bruised. I wondered if he was still alive, wondered if he'd ever found out what happened to his son. I wondered if he'd blame himself for saying those 3 words that had set me on this path. I thought about my former life, about all those years I'd spent searching, about all the time I'd wasted chasing something that was ultimately going to end up killing me. Maybe everyone had been right all along. Maybe I really was insane, had been since I was 17, and this was always how it was going to end. That's when I found the chamber. I was crawling through yet another narrow passage, so weak I could barely move forward, when suddenly the space opened up around me. The faintest gray glow filtering down from somewhere far above, but after days in absolute pitch-black darkness, it looked like the sun itself. It looked like salvation. My eyes, which had been straining in darkness for so long, they'd started to see phantom lights and shapes, slowly adjusted to the dim illumination. The chamber was massive, easily the size of a high school gymnasium, maybe 100 feet across and 60 feet high at the center, where the faint light was filtering down through some crack or shaft that connected to the surface. And it wasn't empty. It wasn't a natural, untouched cave. This was a living space. There were structures here. Primitive shelters made from stacked stones and woven branches leaned against the chamber walls, providing enclosed spaces for sleeping or storage. Piles of what looked like bedding material, thick layers of moss and dried grass, and fur formed into nest-like beds, were scattered throughout the chamber. Stone ledges had been turned into storage areas with food supplies carefully organized and protected. There were piles of nuts still in their shells, bundles of dried berries, strips of meat hung to dry from natural stone projections. Everything was organized, maintained, cared for. This wasn't random. This wasn't animals living by instinct. This was intelligence. This was planning. This was a home. I'd found a Bigfoot den, an actual living space used by multiple Bigfoot for what had to be extended periods of time, maybe even year-round. And more than that, I'd found the answer to the biggest question that had plagued Bigfoot researchers for decades. How do they survive winter? How do they remain so completely hidden despite thousands of people searching for them every year? They lived underground. They'd created entire communities in these mountain cave systems, safe from the harsh weather and predators and human eyes. It was brilliant. It was perfect. And it explained everything. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. My exhaustion disappeared. My hunger faded to a distant ache that I could almost ignore. After 30 years of searching, after decades of being mocked and dismissed, I'd found something no other researcher had ever seen. Proof not just that Bigfoot existed, but that they were intelligent, organized, capable of complex social structures and long-term planning. They weren't just big apes wandering through the forest. They were something far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. I wanted to explore every inch of the chamber, to document everything I saw, to memorize every detail so I could describe it all later. But I forced myself to move carefully and quietly. If Bigfoot lived here, and all the evidence said they did, they could return at any moment. And I remembered that face I'd seen in the mountain crack, those intelligent eyes watching me with awareness and calculation. These weren't mindless animals. They were thinking beings who understood territorial invasion, who would recognize me as an intruder in their home. and I had no idea how they'd react to finding a human in their sanctuary. I found a hiding spot behind a large boulder near one of the chamber walls. It was positioned in a shadowy area where the faint light from above didn't quite reach, and it offered a view of most of the den while keeping me concealed. From there, I could observe without being immediately visible. My stomach was screaming at me to take some of that food from the storage areas, to grab a handful of berries or some of that dried meat, and end the painful emptiness that was making my vision blur and my hands shake. But I resisted. If I disturbed anything, they'd know immediately that someone had been here. And I had a strong feeling that Bigfoot didn't take kindly to uninvited guests. I didn't have to wait long. Maybe an hour after I'd hidden myself, though my sense of time was completely unreliable at that point, I heard movement echoing from one of the tunnels that branched off from the main chamber. Heavy footsteps, multiple sets of them growing louder as they approached. The sound of something massive moving through stone passages. My heart started hammering against my ribs so hard it actually hurt. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get out of there before whatever was coming arrived. But there was nowhere to go. I didn't know which tunnels led to the surface, and I was too weak to run anyway. So I pressed myself against the cold stone behind the boulder and tried to become invisible, tried to quiet my breathing and my pounding heart and become just another shadow in the darkness. 3 Bigfoot emerged from the tunnel. The first one was absolutely massive, easily 8 feet tall, with shoulders that were so wide it seemed impossible they could fit through the passage. Its fur was dark brown, almost black in the dim light, and matted with dirt and debris and what might have been dried mud. The build was incredibly powerful, with a barrel chest and arms that looked like they could tear a tree apart. Behind the big one came 2 smaller Bigfoot, maybe 6 or 7 feet tall, with lighter brown fur. Young ones, I realized with shock. Juveniles. The massive one was leading its offspring home. I held my breath until my lungs burned. From my hiding spot behind the boulder, I had a nearly perfect view of the chamber. I watched as the adult Bigfoot moved through the space with purposeful strides, checking the food stores with what looked like experienced efficiency, examining the sleeping areas to make sure everything was as it should be. The 2 younger Bigfoot followed close behind, and I could see them interacting in ways that were unmistakably familial. One of the juveniles picked up something from the ground, maybe a nut or a small stone, and showed it to the other one, and they seemed to communicate through a series of low grunts and hand gestures. The adult turned to look at them, made a soft sound in its throat, and the juveniles immediately quieted down. The adult Bigfoot moved to one of the food storage areas and pulled down some strips of dried meat, tearing off pieces and handing them to the juveniles. They sat together in one of the larger nest-like sleeping areas, the adult positioning itself between the 2 younger ones, and ate together. Between bites, the adult groomed the juveniles, using its massive hands to carefully pick through their fur, removing debris and parasites. The younger Bigfoot leaned into the grooming, clearly enjoying the attention and care. It was such a profoundly human scene, such a recognizable display of parental care and family bonding, that I almost forgot for a moment that I was watching creatures that science claimed couldn't possibly exist. More Bigfoot arrived over the next several hours. Some came alone, others in pairs, all of them carrying things. Fresh plants still dripping with moisture from underground streams, bundles of sticks that they added to the existing shelters, even what looked like small rodents or rabbits that had been freshly killed. They moved through the chamber like a well-organized community, each individual knowing their role, each contributing to the collective survival of the group. I counted 7 Bigfoot in total, ranging from the massive adult I'd seen first, who was clearly the alpha or leader, down to a small juvenile that couldn't have been more than 4 feet tall, and moved with the uncertain coordination of someone very young. They had a clear hierarchy, I realized, as I watched them interact. The big adult was obviously in charge, making decisions about food distribution and settling minor disputes with low vocalizations and specific gestures. When two of the mid-sized Bigfoot started to disagree over something, pulling at the same piece of food or vying for the same sleeping spot, the alpha would intervene with a grunt and a hand motion, and the dispute would be immediately resolved. The others deferred to it completely, waiting for approval before taking food or rearranging sleeping areas or making any significant changes to the den. It was exactly like watching a family unit, or maybe more accurately, like observing a small tribe with clear social rules and established leadership. As I watched, trying to memorize every detail, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of the Bigfoot, a medium-sized one with fur that was lighter than the others, more of a reddish brown than dark brown, kept glancing in my direction. Not directly at me, not in a way that suggested it could see me behind the boulder. But it would look at the area where I was hiding, pause in whatever it was doing, tilt its head slightly like it was listening or sensing something, and then go back to its activities. Every 10 or 15 minutes, its attention would return to my hiding spot. It would stare for a moment, sometimes sniffing the air, sometimes just watching with those dark, intelligent eyes. It knew. Somehow that Bigfoot knew I was there. Maybe it could smell me despite the overwhelming animal scent that filled the chamber. Maybe it could hear my heartbeat, which was thundering so loud in my own ears I was amazed the whole group couldn't hear it. Or maybe it just sensed that something was wrong, that an intruder had invaded their home, and it was staying alert while trying not to alarm the rest of the group. Whatever the reason, I was certain that the lighter-furred Bigfoot was aware of my presence, even if it couldn't pinpoint my exact location. The gray light filtering into the chamber from above began to fade as evening approached somewhere on the surface. The Bigfoot settled into their sleeping areas, the adults positioning themselves protectively around the juveniles in arrangements that maximized safety and warmth. They communicated softly with each other through low vocalizations and gentle touches, saying goodnight in their own way. The chamber grew quieter, the only sounds the constant drip of water and the occasional grunt or shuffle of movement as someone adjusted their sleeping position. I realized with growing horror that I was trapped. I couldn't leave without crossing the open chamber, and any movement would immediately alert them to my presence. I was going to have to stay hidden in this spot, pressed against cold stone until they left the den. But I had no idea when that might be. Tomorrow morning, tomorrow afternoon, days from now? And even if I waited until they left, I still had no idea how to find my way back to the surface. I was still hopelessly lost in this underground maze. Hours crawled by. My body ached from staying motionless in the same cramped position. My legs were asleep, tingling painfully. My back screamed from being pressed against rough stone. My throat was so dry it felt like sandpaper. And that big foot with the lighter fur, even as the others slept deeply, remained partially alert. I could see one of its eyes occasionally opening to scan the chamber, always lingering on my hiding spot just a moment longer than anywhere else. It was standing guard, I realized, protecting its family from the threat it could sense but couldn't quite locate. It knew something was wrong, and it wasn't going to rest until it figured out what. When the gray light began to seep back into the chamber hours later, signaling morning on the surface, the Bigfoot started to stir. The large alpha rose first, stretching in a way that was startlingly human-like, arms extended above its head, back arched. It grunted loudly to wake the others, a morning call that said it was time to get moving. One by one, they roused themselves from their sleeping areas and began their daily routines. Some went to the food stores for breakfast, pulling down dried berries and meat. Others disappeared into small side tunnels, probably to relieve themselves or collect fresh water from underground streams that I could hear flowing somewhere in the distance. That's when the light-furred Bigfoot made its move. While the others were distracted with their morning activities, it walked deliberately toward my hiding spot. My entire body tensed. There was no way to run, nowhere to go, even if my legs had been working well enough to carry me. The Bigfoot stopped about 10 feet from the boulder I was hiding behind, close enough that I could see individual hairs in its fur rippling as it breathed. I could see its chest rising and falling with deep, measured breaths. As it tested the air, nostrils flaring as it tried to identify the scent it had been sensing all night. Then it took another slow step closer, its dark eyes scanning the shadows where I was pressed against the stone. I was absolutely certain this was it. 30 years of searching. And it was going to end with me being discovered and probably killed by the very creatures I'd spent my entire adult life trying to find. The Bigfoot took one more careful step, and now it was close enough that I could see the intelligence in its dark eyes, could see the individual strands of lighter fur around its face, could count the wrinkles in the skin around its nose and mouth. It was studying the area intently, head tilted slightly, trying to pinpoint exactly where the intruder was hiding. It looked right at me. Our eyes met, and I saw absolute recognition there. It knew exactly where I was, had probably known all along, but had been trying to confirm before acting. For a long moment that felt like it stretched into eternity, we just stared at each other in complete silence. I could see my death in those eyes. I could see this massive creature deciding what to do about the human intruder in its family's home. Then, incredibly, impossibly, the Bigfoot did something I never could have predicted in a million years. It reached down to the ground with one of its massive hands, picked up a piece of dried meat from one of the nearby food storage areas, and carefully tossed it to me. The meat landed at my feet with a soft thump. The Bigfoot watched me for another second, its expression unreadable, then turned and walked back to the others like nothing had happened. It didn't call out or raise an alarm or alert the group to my presence. It just returned to the family and started its morning routine, occasionally glancing back in my direction with what I could swear was a knowing look. I sat there in complete shock, staring at the piece of meat on the ground in front of me. A Bigfoot had just shown me mercy. More than mercy, it had shown me compassion. It knew I was starving, knew I was weak, and no threat to them, and instead of raising the alarm and having me driven out or killed, it had fed me. The implications of that simple act were absolutely staggering. This wasn't an animal operating purely on instinct. This was a being capable of empathy, of making conscious, ethical choices about how to treat others, even others from a completely different species. It was making decisions based on compassion rather than fear or aggression. Over the next few hours, I watched the Bigfoot go about their daily lives with fascinated attention, absorbing every detail I could. They were meticulous about maintaining their living space. They groomed each other, reinforced the stone shelters when needed, organized their food stores with obvious care and planning. They communicated with each other through an incredibly complex system of vocalizations that range from deep grunts to high-pitched whistles, combined with elaborate gestures and what looked almost like rudimentary sign language. Watching them interact, I could identify different tones that seemed to convey specific meanings. A sharp grunt meant stop or pay attention. A low rumble was affection or approval. A series of quick chirps seemed to be a question or request for clarification. The juveniles played in ways that reminded me powerfully of human children. They'd chase each other around the chamber, wrestling and tumbling over each other while the adults watched with what I swear was amusement. When the play got too rough, An adult would intervene with a low vocalization that meant settle down. The younger Bigfoot were learning constantly, mimicking the adult's actions, practicing the gestures and vocalizations they'd need as they grew older. It was education, cultural transmission, the passing down of knowledge from one generation to the next. Eventually, the group left the den, heading out through one of the larger tunnels in what was clearly a coordinated foraging expedition. The alpha led the way with the other adults surrounding the juveniles protectively. I waited until their footsteps had faded completely into the distance, then waited another 30 minutes to be absolutely certain they were gone. Then I finally allowed myself to eat the piece of meat that had been given to me. It was tough and strongly flavored, probably deer or elk that had been dried for long-term storage, but it was the best thing I'd ever tasted. I chewed it slowly, savoring every bite, feeling strength returning to my body with each swallow. That's when I began exploring the chamber more thoroughly, and that's when I made the discovery that would ultimately change everything I thought I knew about Bigfoot. In a recessed area at the far end of the chamber, hidden behind one of the larger stone shelters where it wouldn't be immediately visible to anyone entering the main space, I found something that made me question every assumption I'd ever made about these creatures' intelligence and capabilities. Cave paintings, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, covering every inch of the walls from floor to ceiling in the recessed area. They were crude compared to human art, yes, but they were unmistakable and deliberate. Images of Bigfoot hunting, carefully rendered depictions showing groups of them working together to bring down large game. Images of Bigfoot families, adults, and juveniles together in groupings that suggested both current generations and historical record-keeping. Images of Bigfoot interacting with other animals, some suggesting cooperation or coexistence, others showing conflict or competition for resources. And then there were the paintings that included humans. Small figures drawn next to the much larger Bigfoot forms, sometimes in peaceful interaction, sometimes in conflict. These paintings showed trading or sharing of resources. Others depicted humans hunting Bigfoot, or Bigfoot fleeing from groups of armed people. There was an entire visual history here, painted in natural pigments that had been carefully prepared from crushed minerals and plant matter. Some of the paintings were relatively fresh, the color still vibrant. Others were so faded and worn they were barely visible, worn smooth by time and possibly by countless Bigfoot hands touching them over generations. They'd been maintaining this record for what had to be hundreds of years, maybe thousands. Bigfoot had art, they had history, they were documenting their lives and experiences, passing down knowledge to future generations through visual storytelling. This wasn't just intelligence, this wasn't just tool use or social organization, this was culture. This was abstract thinking and symbolic representation and the transmission of accumulated knowledge across generations. And it meant that Bigfoot was far, far more advanced than anyone had ever imagined. They weren't just smart animals, they were people. Different from humans, yes, but people nonetheless, with their own society and traditions and recorded history. I spent hours studying those paintings, my mind racing as I tried to understand what they were telling me and what they meant for everything we thought we knew about human uniqueness and intelligence in the animal kingdom. Some paintings depicted what looked like the construction of these very shelters, showing Bigfoot working together to stack stones and weave branches. Others showed the preparation and storage of food, seasonal patterns of gathering and hunting. There were paintings that seemed to serve as maps, showing cave systems and surface landmarks that the Bigfoot used for navigation. But the painting that affected me the most, the image that I still see when I close my eyes at night, was near the bottom of one wall in what seemed to be a position of importance or special meaning. It showed a lone Bigfoot figure standing at the edge of what I interpreted as this very cave chamber. based on the distinctive features that were carefully depicted. The Bigfoot had its hand raised in what could only be described as a wave or goodbye gesture. And walking away from it, back toward what the artist had indicated was the surface world through careful use of lighter colors and upward-pointing lines, was a small human figure. It was a goodbye. It was an acknowledgement that our two species could meet, could even help each other in times of need, but that ultimately we belonged in different worlds. It was a message left by some ancient Bigfoot artist for future generations. If a human stumbles into our home, show them mercy, give them what they need to survive, and then let them return to their own kind. The painting was a lesson in compassion and a recognition of boundaries. It was saying we can coexist, but only if we respect each other's space and each other's right to remain separate. That's when I understood what I had to do. The light-furred Bigfoot had shown me mercy for a reason. It had followed the ancient lesson depicted in that painting. It had given me food not just to keep me alive, but to give me the strength to leave. This place, this hidden world beneath the mountains, was their sanctuary. They'd survived for thousands of years by staying hidden, by retreating underground where humans couldn't follow, by becoming legends and myths instead of documented scientific specimens. And if I revealed what I'd found, if I brought researchers and cameras and crowds of curious people to these caves, I would destroy the very thing I'd spent 30 years trying to protect. I had proof. Finally, after 3 decades of searching and sacrificing and being mocked, I had undeniable proof that Bigfoot existed, that they were real, intelligent, cultured beings with their own complex society and recorded history. I had seen their living spaces, watched their family interactions, studied their art and their carefully maintained food stores, and their organized social structure. I had proof that would make me famous, that would vindicate everything I'd believed, that would force the entire world to acknowledge that I'd been right all along. But I couldn't share it, not in the way I'd always imagined, not in a way that would bring Bigfoot out of the shadows and into the spotlight of human scrutiny and scientific examination. When the Bigfoot returned to the chamber that evening, laden with fresh food and materials they'd gathered during the day, I was ready to leave. I'd found one of the tunnels that led upward, following the slight current of fresher air and the faint sound of the wind that suggested a connection to the surface. As I prepared to slip away while they were distracted with unpacking their day's haul, I saw the light-furred Bigfoot watching me again. This time I didn't hide or try to avoid its gaze. I stepped out from behind the boulder and faced it directly, acknowledging its awareness and its mercy. We looked at each other for what felt like a very long time. I wanted to say something, to express my gratitude somehow, to let it know that I understood what it had done for me. But I knew it wouldn't understand human words, so instead I did something simple and hopefully universal. I raised my hand, palm out, in what I hoped was a gesture of peace and gratitude that might transcend species boundaries. The Bigfoot tilted its head, studying me with those dark, intelligent eyes. Then, slowly and deliberately, it raised its own massive hand in response, mirroring my gesture. And in that moment, I knew we understood each other perfectly. I backed away toward the tunnel entrance, keeping my eyes on the Bigfoot until the last possible moment before the passage curved and blocked my view. It didn't follow. It didn't alert the others to my departure. It just stood there, hands still raised, watching me leave in peaceful silence. Then I turned and started the long climb back to the surface, back to the world above, back to my own kind. It took me 2 full days to find my way out of those caves. I was weak, severely dehydrated, and half delirious by the time I finally saw actual sunlight filtering through a crack ahead of me. I stumbled out onto a mountainside I didn't recognize, miles from where I'd originally entered the cave system. I collapsed by a small stream, drank until I thought my stomach would burst, and then just lay there in the sunshine for hours, unable to move. The search and rescue team found me a day later, alerted by a hiker who'd spotted me lying by the water. They asked what happened, demanded to know why I looked like I'd been through a war zone. I told them I got lost while hiking, fell into a cave system, spent several days trying to find my way out in the darkness. It wasn't technically a lie, just an incomplete version of the truth. I didn't tell them about the Bigfoot. I didn't tell anyone. And I never went back to those mountains. After 30 years of searching, of obsessing, of sacrificing everything for proof, I walked away from it all completely. People who knew about my Bigfoot research thought I'd finally given up, finally accepted that it had all been a fantasy and a waste of time. They thought the near-death experience in the caves had knocked some sense into me. They were relieved that I'd finally come to my senses and decided to live a normal life. Let them think that. Let them believe whatever they wanted. So I'm telling this story not to reveal their location or encourage others to go searching for their hidden homes. I'm not going to give coordinates or describe specific landmarks that would help anyone find those caves. I'm telling it because I want people to understand something critically important. Just because we can find something doesn't mean we should. Just because we can prove something exists doesn't mean we need to expose it to the world. Just because we have the capability to study and document every living thing on this planet doesn't mean we're obligated to do so. That Bigfoot could have killed me easily. It could have alerted the others to my presence with a single vocalization, and I would have died in those caves. Another missing hiker who ventured too far into the wilderness and never came back. But it chose compassion instead. It chose to help me, to feed me, to let me witness their lives for a brief moment before sending me back to my own world with my life intact. That decision, that choice to show mercy to an intruder from a species that has historically been a threat to their survival, changes everything. Most importantly, I found that sometimes the most profound discoveries are the ones we keep in our hearts, rather than share with the world. Sometimes knowing the truth is enough, and we don't need the validation of having everyone else know it too. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give to the mysteries of our world is to let them stay mysterious, to let them continue to inspire wonder and curiosity without reducing them to facts and data points. That's my story. 30 years of searching, 3 days in a Bigfoot den beneath a mountain, and a lifetime ahead of keeping the most important secret I've ever discovered. I hope you'll understand why I can't tell you where those caves are located, why I won't describe the specific mountains or give any details that might help someone else find them. I hope you'll respect that some things need to remain hidden for their own protection, and that my responsibility to the Bigfoot who showed me mercy outweighs any obligation I might have to satisfy human curiosity. Because Bigfoot is real. They exist right now in this very moment, in hidden places throughout the wilderness of North America. They're living their lives, raising their families, maintaining their culture, surviving in the margins and the hidden spaces that humans haven't quite reached yet. And the best thing we can do for them, the most respectful and compassionate thing we can possibly do, is exactly what they've been asking us to do all along through their elaborate efforts to remain hidden. Just let them be. Let them exist in peace. Let them continue their ancient way of life without human interference. And let the mystery remain a mystery, because some things are more valuable as questions than as answers. For more interesting stories, check this out.